Part 2. Objects in Motion. Chapter 6. Krug. Caleb bin Krug, daughter of the warlord of the city of Krug, princess of the nation of Yosha, and the most beautiful woman east of the mighty Marden River, was shopping when she met the strange Argivian. She had sampled the new shipment of plums from the Yoshan coastal provinces and been shown the sheerest and most colorful of fabrics from Zegon. She had been offered the freshest of spices from far-off Almaz and the largest of the great clawed river prawns of the upper Marden. A group of Sardian dwarves offered to sell her golden earrings, which they swore once belonged to the greatest empress. A nomad woman dressed in scarves offered to predict the princess's fortune from the lines on her palms. And all of this was done with great ceremony and respect, which Caleb found extremely pleasing. There were, after all, advantages to being a princess. She examined handfuls of the lustrous ice stones of Saranth, gems crystal clear and hard as steel. She ran her fingers over the thick weaves of Phalagi rugs imported from Tomikul. A minstrel serenaded her with verses that he swore he made up on the spot to honor her. A group of street jesters built a human pyramid on her behalf. Storekeepers left the stores with some sample of food, linen, or craft they wanted to show to the most important woman in the city of Krug. But Caleb bin Krug had a purpose to her journey through the merchant's quarter. This was no whimsical spree, though if it was, none would dare to question it except perhaps her father, who was a bit of a grump about such things. She held that purpose in a small clasp purse clutched close to her breast. She had not told her father the reason for her journey, nor had she informed the guards assigned to protect her person, nor even the redoubtable matron who served as her official chaperone on such larks. But she had a purpose, and that goal brought a spring to her step. At each stop during her itinerary she asked about the other shops nearby. There were taverns, clothing shops, hat makers, gem crafters, bead stringers, and all manner of shops, large and small. But only when someone mentioned a clockmaker did her dark brown eyes light up. That would be her next stop, she informed the matron, who in turn told the guards, who in turn asked for directions and cleared a path through the rebel for her royal highness's visit. The clockmaker's shop was a small one, even by the crowded standards of the crowded merchant district of Krug. It was a narrow, two-story building tucked between a blacksmith's forge and a jeweler. The first floor was made smaller still by a low counter that ran most of the way across the width of the room, separating the clockmaker's workshop from the display and customers. The guards remained outside, but only an act of the gods would keep the matron from her place, glued securely to the princess's side. Kayla's nose wrinkled as she entered the shop. It smelled of wood and oil and other things she could not put a name to and would rather not try. There was noise. One clock ticking was an amusing distraction. 10 was an irritation, and here there were no fewer than 20 mounted along the right and left walls. Great pendulums swung back and forth in smooth rhythms, while other timepieces chimed softly to indicate the passage of each fleeting instant. It was both charming and overwhelming. The clockmaker was typical of his breed, well-fed, as her father would say, turning the reference from one concerning another's health to an endorsement of his own farming policies. Actually, this fellow was a bit more than well-fed, verging on stout. He could give the matron a run for her money in the heft. department, and Kayla wondered for a moment if all three of them could stand to be in the same building. In addition to being stout, the clockmaker was balding, with grey hair showing at the temples. He wore a set of Argivian spectacles common to those crafts requiring detailed work. He was dressed in an oil-spattered shirt covered only partially by a heavy leather vest. The vest either belonged to a younger relation, or had been purchased when the clockmaker was thinner. "Your most esteemed highness," burbled the clockmaker. Groveling was a typical greeting for the princess in Krug. Entire workshops and stores came to a screeching halt at her entrance as the staffs bowed, scraped, and fawned. The clockmaker twittered with the best of them. "I cannot believe how fortunate we are to have your illustrious presence gracing my humble shop," he murmured in rapid cadence. "I am honored, truly honored." "You make clocks," she said sweetly, and the clockmaker's eyes lit up as if she had just announced the arrival of the gods. "Yes, yes," he said emphatically. "This is the house of Rusko, home of the clocks of Rusko, and we bid you welcome. Is our most radiant majesty interested in a timekeeping mechanism?" "No," said Kayla shortly. Indeed, she could imagine few things more irritating than clocks. They were necessary, she realized, for those poor, sad people who had to be at a certain place at a certain time, but that did not apply to her. Events began when she arrived, and everyone else was already ready for her. She set down the clasp bag on the counter and opened it. "I have an item here in need of repair. It belonged to my mother, but it has not worked in years." She produced a small silver box from her bag. It was so brightly polished that it seemed to suck sunlight from outside the store in order to add to its luster. Kayla caught sight of her own reflection in the lady clear eyes of deepest brown, lustrous raven dark hair, soft lips that just verged on pouting. She liked to think that everyone would make a fuss over her, even if she were not the daughter of the most powerful man in Yosha. She handed it to the clockmaker, who turned it over in his hands as if it was a live mouse. Carefully he placed a thumb against the latch, and the top sprang open soundlessly. "Ah," he said, then repeated for emphasis, "Ah." Kayla was suddenly sure that the clockmaker had never seen such a device in all his days. "It is supposed to play music when it is opened," she said. "Yes," said the clockmaker quickly. "Yes, of course it does." He closed the box and turned it over in his hands a few times. Then he touched his fingers to his lips, his brow pursed, and set it down on the counter. He looked up at Kayla and smiled, a kind of greasy leer. "Let me call my assistant for this one. Young eyes and deft hands and all that." Without waiting for her response, he turned and shouted toward the back of the shop. "Assistant. Counter." Kayla looked in the direction of the shout and saw the clock maker was addressing a slender, blonde man who had been working at a bench toward the back. She had not noticed him because he had not risen and come forward when she entered. That fact struck her as odd. Everyone rose and came forward when she entered. The young man was tall but not too tall, lean but not too lean, and handsome but not in an obvious way. His hair was the color of white gold, pulled into a simple ponytail. He ambled toward the front counter, raised an eyebrow, and said, "How can I help, good lady?" Upon hearing his accent, Kayla was doubly reassured. The clipped tone of his words indicated he was an Argivian and as such unlearned in how to treat true royalty. The king was weak in Argive, and she had heard the nobles did as they pleased. Second, and more important, she thought he was an Argivian and young. Argivians knew how to handle artifacts and old mechanisms. The clockmaker presented the silver box. Her Majesty has an item in need of repairs, he said, stressing the introduction. Enough so there would be no question as to station with the stranger. It's a music box. The Argivian picked up the box and turned it over in his hands a few times. To Kayla's eyes he was much more sure of himself than the clockmaker had been. And the problem is, he asked. It doesn't work, hissed the clockmaker. It's supposed to play music. Oh, said the stranger calmly. Well, let's see what the problem is. He flipped the box over and pressed both thumbs against the base. The box gave a sharp, distinct snap. Caleb Krug jumped at the sound, and the clockmaker looked as if he was going to faint dead away. Had the apprentice just destroyed a priceless heirloom? Kayla wondered. Then she saw that in reality all the young man had done was slip a panel from the box's base. Within the case was a maze of gears and metal. It did not seem to belong inside a container so delicate and precious. Here's the problem, said the Argivian, his quick fingers delicately probing and poking the apparatus. The mainspring is knocked out of its socket. Hold on. He left the box on the counter and retreated to his own bench, returning with a thin tool with a crooked tip. This should hit it, he murmured. There was a soft click, and the stranger smiled. There you go. He slipped the bottom panel into place with another loud snap and handed it back to the princess. Their fingers brushed as he did so. Caleb Krug took the box and opened it. Nothing happened. The matron scowled deeply. Kayla regarded the stranger coldly and lifted an immaculate eyebrow. The clockmaker suddenly looked apoplectic. If you've broken the princess's music box, well, you have to wind it, said the Argivian, and Kayla was sure there was a hint of smugness in his voice. You have the key, don't you? Key, said Kayla. Let me see, said the Argivian, holding his hand out. The princess handed the box back, their fingers touching again. The young stranger took the music box back behind the counter and rummaged through several drawers. Finally he lifted his head and returned to the front of the shop. Key, he said. Found one that fit the winding peg. He held up a thick, inelegant key made of some dull, common metal, rusted along one side. He inserted the key, gave it a few quick turns, pulled it out, and then handed the box back to the princess. Try it now. Kayla opened the box, and a soft, tinny music filled the shop. For a moment she forgot the incessant ticking that surrounded them. It sounded like small pixies playing crystalline bells. There seemed to be one tune, and a second, softer one playing underneath the first. She held the box to her ear and said, I hear two songs. The Argivian nodded. It's a contratempo. Two distinct melodies in different times weave in and out. I remember having a music box like that as a child, though, of course, one not so elegant and well-crafted. Kayla smiled, taking the compliment as a reflection on her. She closed the box, and the music stopped. Thank you, she said. The Argivian held out the thick key. "Take this with you too. Wind it." The clockmaker lashed out an arm with a speed that belied his girth, then held the key aloft, presenting it formally to the princess. "The music box of Krug with the key of Roscoe," he said, laying the key in Kayla's dainty hand. The princess looked at the Argivian. "You are Roscoe." The Argivian smirked, and it was definite smirk. "He is Roscoe. I am Urza. And you'll be able to have a better-looking key made at any jeweler's." "Thank you, good Sir Urza," she said, with a gracious smile, aimed directly at the young man. That smile had melted courtiers and dashing young captains. The Argivian named Urza smiled back, apparently unmoved, and said, "Be sure not to overwind it. That's probably what knocked the spring out in the first place. Just turn the key until you get some resistance." He spoke to the matron, whom he apparently assumed would take care of such tasks as music box winding. Kayla smiled again but did not offer her hand. She glided out of the shop, her matron in tow. The fat woman was scowling, as if she had not understood what had just happened. Out on the street, the matron said to Kayla, "The jeweler." Then, "Milady." Kayla put the silver box back into her clutch purse, but held on to the thick, slightly rusted key. "Eventually," she said, thoughtfully, "but not today. I've had enough shopping for one excursion." With that, the entire procession, guards, matron, princess, hangers-on and well-wishers, steered their way back to the imperial quarter and Daddy's palace. Inside the clockmaker's shop, Roscoe remained glued to the window until the last of the princess's procession had disappeared and the street returned to a semblance of normalcy. "The princess," he said half to himself, rubbing his hands together. His voice had returned to normal. "The princess of Krug was here, in my shop, with an overwound music box." Urza shook his head. "Don't. They have a flunky in charge of such things." "Mind your tongue, lad," said Roscoe sharply. "When you gets out that she was in my shop, admiring my clocks, we'll have more business than we know what to do with." "I didn't notice her admiring any clocks," said Urza. "That's because you weren't paying attention," said Roscoe, with a chuckle. "Which is a tragedy for two reasons. One, she is royalty, and you should always pay attention to royalty. They can hurt you if you don't. And two, even if she wasn't royalty, she's incredibly beautiful, I suppose." "I hadn't noticed," said Urza, retiring to his workbench. "Not noticed," spat Roscoe. A wide smile crossed his face. "You must have ice water coursing through your veins, lad. That, or such beauty is a 10 for a copper in Pendragon." Urza did not reply, and Roscoe shook his head. The young man was a hard worker, but seemed to Roscoe that he had no interests beyond his own bench. 3 months earlier, the youth had appeared seeking employment. He had arrived on some Phalange caravan out of the desert, but his accent marked him as an Argivian, and probably well-born as well. Roscoe guessed he was Sumerian, son of a noble family. Probably got in trouble with his elders for using the wrong soup spoon or something, the clockmaker thought. Roscoe had heard the youth had approached the temple schools, first seeking employment as a scholar. Of course, his lack of religious training counted against him. He then sought employment among the guilds. His Argivian heritage told against him there, too, for most of the guilds took native Yotians first. Rusko was a minor member of the Clockmakers and Jewelers Guild. But poised to expand, he always reminded others and was in need of an extra hand. And the Argivian would work for little more than room and board. Of course, Rusko appreciated the dedicated nature of his new assistant, but he worried that as an Argivian Urza was missing the finer things in life. A dour and pragmatic people, the Argivians were, in Rusko's opinion, and his new assistant confirmed that view. "I think she took an interest in you," he said after a moment. "I noticed the way she looked at you when I presented her." The key of Rusko," said Urza, looking up from his work. "Why did you make such a fuss when you gave her that key?" Said the clockmaker with a fatherly smile. "Let me expand your education, young man. Rule number 1, always sign your work. I don't just sell clocks, I sell the clocks of Rusko." He waved at the assorted timepieces lining the walls. "Always attach your name to your work. That way others know what you did, and your fame spreads as a result. 100 years from now, people will remember Rusko and his clocks." "Only if they are good clocks," returned Urza. "And ours are the finest." Rusko beamed. "How do they know?" "Because we tell them so. Always show what you can do. And always sign your work." Urza had returned to the partially built clock on his bench, and now fiddled with the lever arm of a particularly recalcitrant timepiece. "Are you listening to me?" Rusko asked. "We tell them," said Urza calmly. "Show what you can do. Sign your work. I am listening to you." He did not look up. 3 months. 3 months the Argivian had been working for him, sleeping in the shop at night, and Rusko still knew almost nothing about him. He had employed an enigma, a hard-working enigma, but an enigma nonetheless. Someone needed to show the young man there was more to life than his work. Rusko sighed. Failing anyone else suddenly appearing, that person would have to be he. The older clockmaker observed, "You Argivians are such dull children. So proper and practical. Why does it hurt to admit that? You've just seen a lovely vision." Urza set down the lever arm. "Fine. She was very pretty. Can I get back to work?" "I think it's a lack of gods," said Rusko, holding up both fingers to frame his point. "The people of Argive don't worship that much, day." "Once," returned Urza. "Not much these days." "That's the problem," said Rusko, placing a palm flat against the work table. "No gods, no life. You've reduced your gods to sayings and psalms, parables and dry scriptures. Yoshi's gods are alive and well. We have an overflowing pantheon and bring more in for the hinterlands. Bokmabok, Horiel the Swift, Gia the Earthpower, Thindar, Rinda, Melin. A god for every occasion," said Urza dryly. "Exactly," cried Rusko. "Whatever you do, some deity approves of it, or disapproves of it, or has some dire warning about it. It's much more exciting that way." "Seems like a waste of energy," said Urza. "Unless, of course, you're in charge of the temples that benefit from all this veneration." Rusko waved at and at his assistant in frustration. "You miss the point. A Yoshin would at least admit that he saw a very pretty and powerful young lady. He'd enjoy that revelation. You are just denying it, and in the process you stunt your soul." Urza set down his tools and took a deep breath, then smiled. deeply and shook his head. "I admit it, good Sir Rasko. She was lovely, radiant. And now that I have admitted it, what can you or I do about it? The warlord probably has her already promised to some powerful noble or faction leader to seal an alliance." Rasko looked hard at the young man, trying to determine if the Argivian was merely making fun of him. Then the clockmaker smiled. "There you would be wrong, my lad. Oh yes, the warlord had a wedding all arranged, but the young man in question drowned. His ship reefed in a storm en route to Corlus, and they call it the Shielded Sea, by Bok and Mabok. No love lost, of course." He snorted. "You saw how deeply she was in mourning. She is free for a moment, free to pursue her own interests. But only for a moment," said Urza, "for your warlord probably has some other plan for his daughter. And then neither you nor I will ever see her again." Rasko sighed. The lad had all the romantic spirit of a box of nails. Urza turned once again to his workbench. "Now, if you would like to get back to business, I've found why this old Kessin clock you have is losing time. The warlord did have a plan for his daughter, though not one that Rasko would have thought of. The warlord had spent his early days in battle, married late, and fathered still later. Kayla was the apple of his eye and the prize of his kingdom. She was not a gift he gave away lightly. Around him the warlord saw a nation at peace. His last major campaign, in which he had seized and held the sword marches and incorporated Amitayosha, was decades in the past. An entire generation, including his daughter, had been brought up in a land without war. The warlord hated it. He was surrounded by soft men and women, courtiers who used words instead of daggers, old generals content to spend their declining years playing with her children, dashing young captains who had earned their commendations by keeping clean uniforms, not by fighting an enemy. Soft, all of them, he thought. Kayla's betrothed had been the best of a bad lot, and the warlord had agreed to that one only after his own counselors made noises about a successor to the throne. And then the damned fool ran aground off Corlus and died. He did not want to see his line diminish, as had been the blood of the weak kings of Argive. His line needed strength. Kayla, his angel, was a strong young woman, and deserved an equally firm mate. He made the announcement the month after the official mourning period for Kayla's intended had passed. His daughter was to marry the strongest man in the kingdom. And to find this man, the warlord had established a test. In the central court before the palace, he erected a great statue. It was made entirely of a single piece of jade, 20 feet in height, crafted with the warlord's face. It took a team of 15 men to winch it into place. His daughter's hand, he decreed, would go to the man who could move the statue from one end of the court to the other. When the first day of the contest arrived, Urza said that it was the stupidest thing he had ever heard of, which statement set Rasko off again on a comparative study of Argive and Yosha. "That is because you have no romance," argued Rasko, locking the shop behind them. Closing the shop seemed to be the only way to get the young man to leave its confines, and Rasko saw the contest as an excellent chance to expose Urza to the finer things that Krug offered. The idea of mighty quests and impossible tasks is in all our folklore, he continued. Look at the saga of Vishant Karna, or how Elorion vied for Titania's love. Urza stopped in the center of the street. But the legends say Bish and Kana died on their wedding day, and Alorian was torn to pieces by Titania's hounds after she rejected him. Rusko made a harumphing noise. I didn't say it was an exact comparison. He headed off down the street to the court. Urza followed, shaking his head. The competition was set for the first of every month, when the warlord and Kayla would attend. Most of the city closed down for those 5 hours while sturdy men tried to win the princess's hand. Servants cleared the court between the statue and the opposite end and set out lines of benches on each side as a makeshift stadium. Urza and Rusko looked down and saw that a group of thick, stalwart men had already gathered in a rough line. The smallest was twice Urza's size, and several looked as if they could take on an elephant bare-handed. From the scars on a few exposed torsos, it appeared some apparently had. At the far end of the court was a low riser, seated on a padded bench where the warlord and his daughter. As Urza and Rusko pressed into the court, a gong sounded. The first suitor strode forward to meet his jade foe. He wrapped his massive arms around the statue's knees and gave a mighty heft. The towering figure did not so much as sway under his assault. The strong man grunted, regained his grip, then tried to lift again. The statue was immobile. The gong sounded again, declaring the attempt over. Another burly individual waddled forward, this one so muscular that he was wider than he was tall. He tried to pry his fingers beneath the edge of the statue, but was rewarded only with crushed digits. Another gong, and a third individual locked his arms around the statue's legs, bending at his knees for better support. This contestant gave a mighty bellow as he attempted to pull the jade figure from its moorings. The bellow became a scream as the muscular man suddenly let go of the statue and dropped to the court's floor, gripping another part of his anatomy. The gong sounded, and a group of temple healers rushed forward to attend to the fallen champion. Come, let's pay our respects, said Rusko, nodding his head toward the royal bench. There was a moving line in front of the warlord and princess. The Yotians passed before the pair, quickly bowing and touching their fingers to their lips in the fashion of that city. Rusko joined the throng, dragging Urza behind him. The clockmaker made a full bow and finger kiss, but Urza merely gave a respectful head bob. And then they were past the royal couple. She looked at you, said Rusko as soon as they were past. She did not, said Urza, shaking his head. She's seen 1,000 people this day alone. She smiled, counted Rusko. She's a princess, said Urza. Smiling is automatic for such people. Were I she, I would be seriously worried that one of those muscle-bound warriors will actually succeed in lugging the statue around. I don't think His Majesty is breeding for intelligence in future generations. Rusko shook his head. You're being too logical, again, too pragmatic. Probably she is sure that no one will succeed. Sooner or later her father will come up with a more reasonable task. What's wrong? Urza was staring intently at the pile of treasure to one side of the dais. What is that? He asked. Rusko blinked. Urza was pointing toward a large pile of gifts, laid out over a luxurious swath of gold cloth. There were great swords, mirrored shields, and armor of the type that no one had worn in generations. Bins of rubies, diamonds, and sapphires glittered in the sunlight, accompanied by red velvet boxes holding crowns and diadems. "That's the dowry," answered Roscoe, and quickly added, "I know what you are thinking with your logical mind. Why does the daughter of the most powerful man in Yosha need a dowry?" "Well, it's a tradition. Those are all old items belonging to the previous warlords. Some date back to the dawn of the nation. Some we made before Krug was even founded." "What of the book?" said Urza. Roscoe had not seen the young man this excited in all the time he had been in Krug. He squinted to see the object to which Urza was referring to. "You mean the one next to the ivory shield?" "Yes, the large one," said the young man. "What is it?" Roscoe leaned forward. "It's a book," he confirmed. "Definitely a book." "Yes, of course it's a book. But look. On the binding are Thran glyphs," snapped Urza. Roscoe blinked again. The young man was positively thrilled by the discovery. Roscoe removed his lenses, rubbed them on his shirt, and put them on his face again. He shrugged. "If you say so. Can you read them from this distance?" Urza was silent a long moment, apparently puzzling out the geometric writing. Then he said, "Jalam. Was there a Jalam in Yosha's history?" Considered Roscoe. "I think there was an advisor or scholar, or a philosopher, long ago, before the temple schools." "Is it important?" Urza looked at the table laden with treasure, then back at the princess. As he looked, she was just turning away from him, apparently intent on the latest attempt to lift the statue. Her face was smooth and impassive and very lovely in the noonday sun. Urza chewed on his lip, then said, "Good Sir Roscoe, I think I want to move the statue." Roscoe could hardly contain his disbelief. "And I want to fly to the moon and kidnap the harem of the Pasha of Sumifa. I'll even settle for my head to hurt less after a night of drinking brandy. But I don't expect it to happen. That's rule one in life. Don't expect the impossible, and you won't be disappointed." "I do expect it to happen," said Urza, staring intently at the huge jade statue. Another contestant was trying to manhandle it to no avail. "But I will need supplies." He turned to the clockmaker, his voice hard and decisive. "Metal bolts, iron root, spurs, and other things. Will you help?" Roscoe stammered for a moment. He was all for romance, but suddenly this posed a threat to his own pocketbook. "Well, I could give you an advance," he said reluctantly. "But you're talking about a sizable outlay." Urza nodded, then said, "Have you heard about ornithopters? The Argivian flying machines?" Roscoe nodded. "I've heard travelers' tales." He paused, then hissed a question at the young man. "You know how they work?" Urza nodded again and said, "I helped build the first ones. I could give you the plans. If I did, would you provide supplies for my work?" Roscoe felt both his heart and his pocketbook opening to the young man. He smiled. "These are wonderful," said Roscoe, thumbing through the plans. The first purchase the clockmaker had made was a supply of parchment and quills, and the young Argivian spent the night sketching out the ornithopters. First was a general description in neat lettering. Then page after page of details, showing how the levers in the pilot's housing functioned, how the wiring operated, of what materials the wings and struts needed to be made, and to what dimensions they had to be machined for perfect Performance. Roscoe was astounded. All this from the quiet scholar who had been repairing his clocks. A trained ape could build ornithopters. For these plans, no, even Roscoe could build an ornithopter from these plans. Marvelous, he muttered, leafing through the loose parchment pages. Amazing. A work of art. The clockmaker could scarcely contain himself, for the machine practically leapt off the page. Fully realized. Urza smiled, but Roscoe could not tell if the smile was in response to his compliments or for his current work. They had curtained off the back of the shop, and Urza had begun constructing a new machine there. Actually, it looked as if he were building a statue of his own to counter the jade one of the warlord. It looked like a beast of curved metal spars fashioned in the upright form of a man. Its limbs were metal frames, cross-bolted in a thick latticework. Its upper torso was thinner metal and ironroot, and it pivoted at the base of the spine. One inelegantly long arm drooped at either side, each looking like that of a gorilla. A roughly hewn helmet, with the faceplate that flipped up or down, served as the head. The face guard was open now, revealing a tangle of cables and gears set around a single, dull gem. It suddenly occurred to Roscoe that Urza had smiled more in the past few weeks than in all the time the clockmaker had known him. They had not been the polite, for the customer smiles, or smug Argivian scholar smiles, or even put up with old Roscoe smiles. The young man seemed more alive as he tinkered with his creation. Roscoe had only made one suggestion during the entire process. "You've got the knees on backward," he said. "Supposed to be that way," muttered Urza, not waiting for a reply. He burrowed back into the creature's chest with a spanner. In 2 months the creation had blossomed from a mixed collection of parts that Roscoe had gathered, caged, or borrowed from other shops into a towering giant. It was vaguely humanoid, and Roscoe wondered if it was based on any living creature. It was not a question he wanted answered. Instead, late at night, as Urza was checking connections and splicing wires, he asked another question. "Who is Mishra?" Urza's rapidly moving fingers almost dropped the splicing tool he was holding. "Someone important to you, I assume," continued the clock maker. Urza stared at Roscoe, and for a moment there was a flicker of coldness on the youth's face. Just for a moment, the quiet, solemn man of the past months was back, and Roscoe was afraid he had lost the smiling Urza forever. Then Urza sighed, and the moment passed. He turned back to his machine. "How do you know if Mishra?" Roscoe fought a temptation to laugh. "You rarely sleep, Urza. But when you do, you talk. You mention Mishra a lot. And another. Takashia." "Takashia," corrected Urza. "Takashia was my teacher. She's dead now," said Roscoe. "And Mishra?" "My brother," said Urza quietly. He peered more intently into the creature's interior. "Alive, I suppose," Urza shrugged. He gazed up with the pretense of working on the wiring and leaned back. "I don't know. We parted on less than friendly terms." Said Roscoe. There was a lot going on beneath the surface there, and he felt resistance to his questions. "And you feel badly about it?" he persisted. "I wish there was something that could have been done to change things," said Urza. Roscoe thought the youth's statement was probably true, as far as it went, but there seemed to be Something more, something yet unsaid. A silence grew between the two men. Finally Rusko broke it. In Yosha, we believe a man has many souls. Did you know that? Urza shook his head, but a small smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. A put-up-with old Rusko smile, the clock maker thought. You don't wear the same clothes as you did when you were a boy, and you won't wear the same clothes when you're older. Rusko continued. The same applies to souls. You have one soul as a child, another as a youth, and several as an adult. Urza shrugged. I wear different clothes. I don't know about souls, though. Rusko stroked his chin. Most Yoshan faiths believe that when you die, each of your souls is judged individually. Let us say your first 3 souls were basically good. Then you became a robber and a thief and grew a 4th evil soul. Then you repented and lived a virtuous life, growing a 5th, more kindly soul. When you die, your souls are judged independently. The first 3 souls, and the 5th, will be rewarded for the virtue. The 4th soul will be sent to hell, destroyed, or sent back depending on what gods you venerate. You are going somewhere with this? Asked Urza. His eyes strayed toward his machine. Rusko smiled. Only that you may be feeling guilty about what happened with your brother, or your late mentor. Don't. You have a new soul since you've arrived here, a Yoshan soul. Let that be your guide. Urza stood for a moment, untangling Rusko's advice. Then he shook his head. Until I talk again with my brother, I will carry my regrets with me. But thank you for your advice. It's very... He paused, then broke into a wide smile. Much like Krug itself. Rusko smiled back, taking the young man's words as a compliment. So, he said, looking up at the titanic figure. Does it work? Not yet. Urza pulled a chain from around his neck. Rusko saw that the chain was attached to a large gem, a dark ruby, flecked with streaks of multicolored fire. Urza climbed the step ladder until he was level with the great creature's head, and pushed the gem inside. Standing on tiptoe, Rusko could see the young man touching the ruby stone to the dead, inert gem in the creature's head. The gem in the creature's head began to glow, slowly, erratically at first, then with a stronger beacon, until it was as strong as the stone Urza held. It radiated with a sapphire. Light shot through, with sparks of white. It was, thought the clockmaker, like watching someone set a fire by placing a burning stick against another. As the new gem glowed, the creature began to move. It raised one arm, then lowered it, then raised it again. The gears and pulleys at the machine's arm and shoulder whined softly as they moved. Urza lowered the creature's visor. The light of the gem shone through its eye holes. There, said Urza. Now the machine has a new soul as well. It was the 3rd month of the competition, and for Kayla it was proceeding much the same way as the first 2. A cavalcade of horns and gongs sounded. A throng of well-wishers passed before her and her father, though there were fewer with each passing month. She noticed a gathering of overly muscled warriors waited their turn to attempt the impossible. Again, there were fewer than previously. On the first day of competition it had all been a great celebration. A month later, at the second trial, it was merely interesting. Now, 2 months after the first day of competition, For her hand, Kayla felt the whole affair was becoming tedious. She reviewed the candidates and suppressed a shudder. This lot might look well behind a plow or pulling one, she thought. Wickedly, but as far as leadership material went, they were sorely lacking. Some part of Kayla's mind gave a mental shrug. What did it matter? After the wedding, she would make all the important decisions. At first, as each took his turn, she imagined what life would be like with each of the hulking brutes. That proved to be less than appealing, so she soon settled on guessing the nature of their injuries after they had failed to move the statue. She had counted so far that day 10 pulled muscles, 3 in the groin, 2 burst intestines, 7 cases of exhaustion, and a head injury. The last was from a young man from the sword marches of the far north, who grew so frustrated that he headbutted the statue. The temple healers hauled him off the field by his feet. The current contestant was a grunter, gripping the statue and trying to pull it down on top of himself. Kayla did not care for grunters. She liked the bellowers better. They made more noise and tended to give up more quickly. The lists had thinned out quickly, and there were now bare spots among the benches for the laurel subjects. She wondered how much longer her father was going to continue this exercise in futility. Probably, she decided, until one of the lesser noble families made a better offer for her hand. Daddy was always doing things in secret. Kayla was resigned to her fate. She had always been a dutiful daughter, and if her father arranged for her to marry a Phalagi, she would live in some desert tent beyond civilization. She was no stranger to court politics. For years, she knew she had been groomed to eventually marry in a fashion that would make Krug stronger. The fact that the original target of that marriage had the misfortune to die before getting the chance to wed her did not change the process in the least. She looked at her father as he watched the proceedings. He had on his solemn face now a cool, thoughtful, and regal. Would the common people think less of him if they knew that after the first day he had cursed like a sailor at the failure of the contestants, storming around the royal suites for a good hour? Probably not, Kayla decided. Her father was a great war hero, a valiant warlord, and she suspected this farce being played out before her represented one last attempt to prove to himself that there were still warriors in Yosha. And she was sure her father felt he could have lifted the jade statue by himself when he was young. Another bellowing titan pulled a groin muscle, and Kayla saw the lists were empty. No, there were 3 figures left. 1 slender, 1 fat, and 1 shrouded in a great cape and hood, who towered over the other 2. The seneschal walked over to the trio, and there was a quick consultation among the 2 smaller figures and the ruler's advisor. The seneschal moved to the warlord's side and spoke in a low voice. "We have one more candidate," said the seneschal, a quaking, nervous man who both loved and feared his warlord, "but it's a bit unusual." The warlord grunted. "The big one?" "No, my lord," said the seneschal. "The thin one. He says he can move your statue by the strength of his mind, if you'll but permit it." A smile crossed the warlord's face, and Kayla knew that it was not one of his more pleasant expressions. Let him, but tell him the penalty for wasting the warlord's time. The seneschal bowed and retreated. Kayla stared at the newcomers. The slender one was attractive, but it was only in proximity to the fat one that she remembered where she had seen him before. He was the Argivian clockmaker, the stranger with the wry smile and clipped accent. For a fleeting moment, Kayla allowed her to think about life. With this one, the prospect was not totally unpleasant. She also wondered if he could truly move the statue with his mind, or if he would sprain his brain in the process. Kayla's memory spun for a moment. Urza, that was the young man's name. She still had his key next to her mother's music box. And his companion, the fat one. She knew she had heard his name at the shop, but nothing came to her now. Urza stepped directly before the statue. Behind him strode the fat man, helping along the titanic cloaked figure. There was a smell in the air, like the air before a storm. The Argivian bowed deeply. I thank the crown for the chance to succeed in a task that has defeated so many others, said Urza. The warlord waved his hand, urging the young man to speed up his speech. Kayla was sure that after today Daddy would abandon this method of choosing a suitor. I will now move the statue by the strength of my mind, declared Urza. Reaching back, he pulled the cape from the large figure behind him. There was a collective gasp from the crowd as the cloth fell away to reveal the figure beneath. It was made of metal, and was human in form. At first Kayla thought it was a living being, but immediately she saw that she had been mistaken. It was a machine. Of course, she thought. He is a clockmaker, after all, and an Argivian. The Argivians were always poking around the old ruins, trying to find powerful devices for their own use. I built this using my mind, said Urza, and the fat man made a harumphing noise. That and using the services of good Sir Roscoe, maker of fine clocks, the youth added. Let what I have built with my mind move your statue. The large humanoid machine lumbered forward, and for a moment, Kayla expected it to pitch over onto the stonework. As it walked, the Argivian stayed next to it, speaking to it, guiding each of its motions. The pair reached the statue. Urza pointed to one side of the statue, and the machine placed a hand, metal with fingers of polished wood, on that location. He pointed to the other side, and the machine placed its other hand there. Urza patted the side of the creature, and it began to lift. After the bellowers, screamers, and grunters, the silence that surrounded the artifact was eerie. There was a slight humming, like the space between the notes of Kayla's music box. The metal humanoid bent at the knees, which seemed, from the princess's vantage point, to be constructed backward, and slowly lifted the figure from the ground. There was a collective gasp from the crowd as daylight appeared beneath the jade statue. The construct pulled the statue straight up, holding it about a foot off the ground. Slowly the great machine spun on its hips, its spine rotating all the way around, so that its knees were pointing forward. Then slowly, the machine started to walk toward the opposite side of the court. It was slow going. The machine could hold the statue, but the courtyard had difficulty supporting both the machine and the statue. Paving stones crushed beneath the giant's feet, and at one point, the great metal creature pitched precipitously to the right as the stones turned to dust beneath the weight of its tread. There was a whining noise as wires pulled through pulleys, and Kayla was sure she was about to see the mechanical equivalent of a groin pull. Urza was at the machine's side at once, examining the problem and shouting orders. The great metal thing responded, tipped the other way, and at last reached its final destination. Urza gave one last command, and the machine set down the jade megalith so that it faced the royal dais. The crowd applauded. Some fled the stands to tell their friends the king's statue had been defeated by a metal creature made by an Argivian. Kayla found herself on her feet applauding as well, but one glance at her father stopped her. His face was a storm cloud, and veins throbbed at his temples. Wordlessly he rose and turned away from the dais, thundering back into the palace. Ever dutiful, Kayla rose as well, but allowed herself the opportunity to look once more at the talented Argivian. He stood there in the center of the court, his machine next to him, the clockmaker on the other side. The common people were already spilling into the courtyard to congratulate him. On his face was a wide, beaming smile. She decided it was a pleasant smile, and smiled back at him. She did not stop to see if he saw her mark of favor, but instead turned and followed her father through the palace doors. She only hoped the warlord would reach a room with thick walls before he exploded. It took 15 minutes for the warlord to stop cursing and another 15 before he was using coherent sentences. Kayla, the seneschal, Kayla's matron, and a brace of nervous courtiers waited for the storm to abate before even venturing an opinion. The temerity! He shouted at the rafters. The insult! How dare that! That! His mouth opened and closed for a moment, until he found the proper word. Weed. That weed thinks he deserves my daughter's hand in exchange for some parlor trick. Well, said the trembling seneschal, you did say her hand would go to whoever could move the statue. The warlord grunted harshly. And you did allow him to try, said the seneschal, gathering strength as he spoke. He said he would move the statue with his mind. But he didn't, bellowed the warlord. That wind-up machine did all the moving. Well, said the seneschal, your daughter could marry the machine. Kayla stifled a giggle, but the joke prompted another cascade of war camp obscenities from the warlord. The seneschal fled under the assault, and Kayla thought at the time out of the discussion entirely. And you, roared the warlord, turning to his daughter, what have you to say of all this? Say, cried Kayla. She was suddenly indignant at being the target of his yelling. I had no say when you wanted me to marry that hapless mariner, she charged, stalking toward her father. I had no say when you decided to award me to the strongest ox in the kingdom. So now, when someone has finally beaten you at one of your little games, I suddenly have a say. The warlord stared at Kayla, stunned by her outburst. His shoulders sagged with defeat. I just want what's best for you. But to have to give you to this foreigner, this Argivian, this weed. You are the warlord of Krug, said Kayla coldly. You can do whatever you want. You can banish him if you want. But if you want my opinion, here it is. He has a pleasant face, a good shape, and seems rather bright. I would not mind being his bride. The warlord's brows furrowed, and Kayla wondered which part her father was thinking about, the fact that she would not mind marrying Urza, or the fact he could have the Argivian banished. Behind her came the squeak of the heavy timbered door, and the seneschal poked his head back in. What? Snapped the warlord. Kayla thought that the seneschal might evaporate entirely. To her surprise, the nervous bureaucrat stood his ground and managed a convincing mule. A visitor. Requests an audience, my lord. The weed, snarled the warlord. Tell him we have not yet ruled as to the legitimacy of his little trick. Not the seneschal gulped and continued, Argivian, his sponsor. The warlord looked at Kayla, and the princess nodded vigorously. Her father could bully most of the staff. Perhaps the little clockmaker had a better chance of making Urza's case. At first it seemed a vain hope. The clockmaker bowed 3 times before reaching the warlord, each bow being a deep knee, buckling affair that consumed time and further shredded her father's patience. As Rusko rose from the third bow, Kayla walked to his side and helped the overweight merchant to his feet, escorting him to the warlord. Your Grace and Your Highness, gasped the fat little man. Conqueror of the sword marchers, bearer of prosperity, master of our fates. The warlord flapped his hand impatiently, while Kayla wondered if the clockmaker talked that way in real life. I bring 2 messages, said Rusko. The first is from my boon assistant and companion, good Sir Urza, the Argivian. He paused and waited for a response. Go on, snapped the warlord, biting off his words as if they were bits of meat. The clockmaker cleared his voice. Sir Urza says that he understands if you choose to rescind your challenge, though he would be very disappointed in losing the companionship of your lovely daughter. He bowed to Kayla, and the princess returned it with a nod. She wondered if what the clockmaker said about Urza's disappointment was true. Is that it? Asked the warlord. The first message, yes, replied Rusko. And the second? Inquired the warlord. The second is from me, said the clockmaker. He lowered his voice somewhat. And this is it. He reached into his vest, pulling out a sheaf of papers. He handed them to the seneschal, who in turn handed them to the warlord. The ruler flipped through the pages and grunted, and these are plans, my grace, said Rusko. Plans for a flying machine. An Argivian flying machine, designed by the talented young good Sir Urza. The warlord looked from the clockmaker to the plans to the clockmaker. The Argivian knows how to build flying machines. Do they work? The clockmaker bowed deeply. I do not know for certain. 2 months ago, I could not tell you that his mechanical man would work. But it has. The warlord looked through the papers a 3rd time. And the Argivian might have other secrets locked up in his mind, he said, almost to himself. I would presume so, said Rusko. He is a private man, closed to all but those closest to him. Definitely in need of a woman's touch to bring out his best. Again he bowed to Kayla. The warlord grew silent, and Kayla knew he was weighing the alternatives. Finally he said, Daughter, did you mean it when you said you would not mind marrying this talented weed? Kayla gave a small nod and said, I spoke truly when I say he is the best candidate you have found so far. The ruler gave out a deep sigh and rubbed his eyes. Handing the plans back to the fat clockmaker, he spoke. Very well. Then let us go back out and congratulate my future son-in-law. The ceremony was ornate, even by Yoshan standards. Krug had more than 30 major temples and a host of smaller ones with important patrons, and everyone wanted to have a say in the wedding. Kayla tried to count the number of officiating priests, but gave up after the 15th or 16th. It was tediously long. Sermons were read. Prayers were chanted. Spirits were banished. Gods were invoked. More sermons. More prayers. The couple kissed icons. They placed hands on scriptures. They danced around a ceremonial pyre. They were doused with blessed water and drank sanctified wine. They freed a dove and burned a scroll of regrets. They paraded beneath unsheathed blades. They received benedictions, blessings, and well wishes. In deference to Urza's Argivian heritage, each wore a gold circlet on his or her brow, each of the circlets joined by a single silver chain. Kayla could not say at what point during the day she was officially married to Urza, scholar of Argive, new chief artificer of Krug. All she could say was that by the end of the day there was no question that she was well and truly married. And through it all Urza was understanding, not impatient in the way most men were about such things. Daddy was visibly uncomfortable after the 7th responsive reading. Nor was the young man visibly bored, or apparently making a show of being tolerant. He seemed to be taking mental notes on everything he saw and commenting on nothing. She expected to see that smug Argivian smile during some of the more rustic and traditional parts of the ceremony, but he took those with good grace as well. And after the interminable ceremonies was an equally long procession through the streets, as the people waved and cast multicolored streamers and waved colored torches. And then a long feast of several dozen courses, each course broken by long toasts from anyone who felt he had something good to say about the princess and her surprising, if still generally mysterious, groom. And when at last the ceremonies and the processions and the feasts were done, long after the midnight bell had sounded, the couple was escorted to their own wing of the palace, into the bridal chamber. The dowry had been placed there, along with some of more tasteful gifts of various powerful well-wishers. The bed was made with sheets of almaz silk and dusted with rose petals. Incense burned from a dozen small braziers, and the room was alight with candles. The servants left the newlyweds there, closing the doors behind them as they departed. Kayla took a deep breath and reached out to her new husband. Urza slowly took her hand, and the princess realized that the slender young man was trembling slightly and almost flinched at the touch. She wondered if he even knew he was shouting his nervousness to her. Instead she said, "You have strong hands." "Working with artifacts," he said, his voice rasping a bit. "You need strong fingers. And a strong mind as well," she said, and drew herself closer to him. His body felt as tight as the spring in her music box. "Kayla," Urza spoke into her hair, "there's something I need to tell you." Kayla froze, but only for a moment. Levelly, she said, "You can tell me anything." "I," said Urza, then backed away from her and looked into her eyes. "I've been told I talk in my sleep." She smiled and pressed 2 fingers against her husband's lips. "It's all right," she said in a throaty whisper. "I'm a very good listener." And she kissed him. Afterward, Kayla's breathing was long and deep. She slept on. Her side nestled against Urza's lanky frame. He touched her brow softly. She squirmed in bed, rolled over, and fell in still deeper slumber. Quietly, Urza rose from his wedding bed. The sky was still an hour from lightening, and the city of Yosha was quiet beneath his window. Beyond his sight, a city exhausted by its own celebration lay wreathed in sleep, and only a few lights still shone between the castle and the Marden River. Slowly, Urza crossed the room. He extinguished each of the guttering candles in the room, save one. This he took to the accumulated dowry. He looked over the pile of treasure, then carefully knelt down and extricated a heavy book marked with thranglyphs on the spine. The Tome of Jalum. Urza took the book to the writing desk on the far side of the bedroom. He set the candle in its holder and looked at his new wife lying in the darkness for a long time. Then he opened the ancient book and began to read. Chapter 7. Makfarwa. Up, slave! Snarled the taskmaster, prodding Mishra's side with his goad. The stocky young man groaned and tried to turn over, earning another sharp prod. In fallagy, the taskmaster repeated the order. Rokik. Kaim. Mishra coughed through a dust-filled throat that he was awake, and he hauled himself to his elbows to prove it. The taskmaster moved on to the next slave as Mishra blinked the dust from his eyes. His dreams had been wrapped in darkness, utter and black. He was alone, all alone, without Takesha, Urza, or any of the others. They had abandoned him. And in that darkness of his dream, there was singing, lovely singing, that issued from his green stone. But he had lost the stone as surely as he had lost the rest of his life. Mishra blinked back the last of the darkness and knew that his waking world was little better than that of his dreams. He was in the camp of the Suwardi. He had been captured and claimed by them. He was property now. He was a slave. He was Rakik. After Takesha's death he had fled northward, toward the cavern at Koilos. He didn't mean to at first, he had just fled. But his feet found their way into the desert and along the long shelf of the mountains, inevitably leading toward the lost canyon. The scrubby, succulent plants that etched out their lives along the desert's borders provided him with life-giving water during the trek. Still, he was thin and weak when the Suwardi outriders found him. At first Mishra thought they were rescuers, friends from among the Fallaji diggers who had come looking for him, sent by Amal or Haja. But the riders who found him were tougher and crueler men than the diggers at camp, hard men with wind-carved faces and no patience for outlanders found in their desert. They wore broad-brimmed, flat helmets that marked them as Suwardi, each bronze helmet inscribed along the brim with the vows of courage in battle. The warriors dragged him back to the camp, but only because it was nearby. Otherwise they would have simply killed him and stripped his body. They took his glittering stone as treasures. Well, but they did not treat it as anything more than an attractive bauble. Mishra had the strength to let out a weak shout as they pulled the bag containing the gem from his neck. That earned him an elbow to the face, a cuff intended both to silence and to train. The Suwardi set Mishra to work with the other slaves. Most were Fallaji, captured from other tribes and held until proper ransom was established or proper loyalties to the Suwardi were ensured. These captives were treated fairly well, as slaves go. There were a few other outlanders as well, hard-scrabble survivors of caravans that did not pay the demanded tolls for traversing Suwardi land. These slaves the tribe worked to death. Of the 7 other outlanders who had been among the slaves when he was first brought there 3 months earlier, Mishra was the sole survivor. There were a few later additions, but they had died quickly. There had been no additional outlander slaves since then. The Suwardi had apparently stopped taking them. So Mishra worked as a slave. He built. He dug. He dragged heavy things. He did not ask questions. Another outlander had asked questions and his teeth were removed with a chisel. Mishra slept when he was allowed. He ate what he was given, which was less than the Qadir's hounds received. And he dreamed. He dreamed of the darkness and the fractured power crystal singing to him. He tried to look for it but found he was too exhausted to move, held captive in the prison of his own flesh. During the day, when he laid stone upon stone, or dug a new cooking pit, midden, or grave, he thought of the dreams. This day, he was digging a trench for some unknown reason. Occasionally, his spade struck a bit of old metal from the age of the Thran, and he tossed it on the pile of churned earth with the other garbage. As he dug and thought, Mishra did not hear his name being called, not the first time, or the second. Only when a hand was laid on his shoulder did the stocky man react. Mishra started and raised an arm to protect himself. No one touched an outlander with good intent in the Suwardi camp. "Master Mishra, it is you!" cried Haja. Mishra looked up at the one addressing him and saw the young, lean-faced digger from Takasha's camp, the one who had accompanied him the night that everything fell apart. But this Haja was wearing a Suwardi helmet, a pair of swords mounted on a harness across his back, and he was smiling. "Are you all right?" asked Haja in Falaji. Mishra waited a moment, then nodded. He had no use for words. For the past few months, and few spoke to him beyond simple orders. A shadow appeared on Mishra's right. It was the taskmaster, who had fewer slaves to deal with over time and kept his hold on his remaining treasures that much tighter. "Do not speak with the Rakik," said the taskmaster sharply. Haja laughed, and Mishra realized that the former digger was taller than the one who ordered him about. "Do you know who you have digging holes for you?" Mishra wanted to say that he enjoyed digging the holes, and Haja should not take that one pleasure away from him. But the words were lost on the way to his mouth. "This man is a great scholar," continued Haja. "He knows things no one other man knows. He has discovered secrets of the old ones. And you have him digging ditches." Haja laughed again. "Scholar." The taskmaster spat into the dust. "That explains why he digs ditches so poorly. Now go away." Haja shook his head. He should not be digging ditches at all. "You're right," the taskmaster exploded. "I expected him to die months ago. He is an outlander and a slave. He works for me. Morik the taskmaster, for the moment. You want him to work for you. Go to the Qadir." Haja paused for a moment, then said, "I shall try not to kill him before I return." And Haja was gone, head held high, heading for the center of camp. Mishra dug energetically, but the taskmaster was displeased with his work. A sharp jab in the side with the butt end of the goad reminded the former scholar that he should not have talkative friends. Mishra groaned under the blow and slowed only slightly as the ache spread through his body. He let the pain pass through him and resumed his digging. At the end of the day, the Suwardi held there was the communal dinner. The Qadir's tent was fed first, then the warriors, then the women and children, then the Qadir's dogs, and finally the slaves. And the Falaji slaves were fed before the outlanders, for there was a reason to keep the Falaji alive. Mishra was chewing a piece of stale, mold-spotted bread when They came for him, men in direct service to the Qadir, with their broad helmets and ornate necklaces of heavy gold. Ceremonial guards, the young man realized. The Qadir of the Suwadi must be doing very well to thus equip his warriors. The guards spoke a few words, unheard by Mishra to Morik. The taskmaster and the brawny master of slaves retired, grumbling, to his own quarters. Then the guards half marched, half dragged Mishra to the Qadir's tent, a broad wax-colored pavilion lit from within. The soldiers stopped outside only long enough to remove the heavy hobbles that bound Mishra's feet. Then they pushed him inside. The tent was soft and smoky. Braziers were lit around the perimeter, and Mishra caught the scent of sandalwood and desert cedar wafting up from them, mixed with other pungent spices. The scent hurt his nose and made his eyes water, but it succeeded in dampening the stench of the Suwadi themselves in these close quarters. The ground was covered with thick rugs woven from the wool of mountain sheep, and stained with food and, in some places, blood. Great reclining pillows were scattered about to either side of the room where the immediate relations of the Qadir, the hangers on, the courtiers, and the ambassadors from the other tribes. At the center of the tent was a platform, raised and covered with slightly cleaner carpets. This was the Qadir's place. The Qadir was a massive man, thick-shouldered, thick-necked, and thick-headed. He was beginning to give in to the results of his own success. His belly spilled slightly over the belt, holding his robes shut. As Mishra entered the tent, the Qadir was helping himself to a great bowl of shelled nuts. At one side of the Falaji leader was seated a similarly built, similarly dressed younger version of the Qadir. On the other side, standing, was Haja. Mishra dropped to both knees, in the Falaji custom, and waited for whatever would come next. The Qadir snorted down a handful of nuts. "This slave dog of the desert is the one you speak of, Haja?" he asked, in Falaji. His voice poured out the words like thick coffee. "That he is, most eminent one," replied Haja in the same language. "And he is a scholar, you say?" said the Qadir. "A most respected one," said Haja, and Mishra noticed that the young version of the Qadir was not smiling. In fact, he looked bored. The Qadir leaned forward and stared at Mishra. "Doesn't look like much of anything, even for an outlander." Laughter rippled among the courtiers, relations, and ambassadors. "Do you judge your horses by the bridles?" asked Mishra. "Or by how hard they serve?" He said it in a low voice, barely more than a whisper. It was a desert saying he had learned from Amal, and the young man said it in perfect Falaji. He did not look up as he said it. He did not say it proudly or angrily, but he did say it. The room grew quiet immediately. The Qadir shot Haja a venomous look that seemed to melt the young man in place. "And the Rakik speaks our language as well," the Qadir observed. Haja bowed nervously. "I said he was most learned in a number of fields." When the thin Falaji looked up, the Qadir no longer looked at him. Instead, he regarded the outlander through heavy-lidded eyes. "You know the legends?" asked the Qadir. "Of the old ones?" "I know of the Thran," replied Mishra. "An ancient race they were, which predated all other living races in the land of Terajare. They left no bones of themselves, but they left the bones of their machines across the deserts. Bones you outlanders picked like vultures," snapped the Qadir. Haja saw Mishra hesitate for a moment. When he spoke, the Scholar chose his words carefully. Those nations of the eastern coast seek to understand that which has come before, the better. To understand what is to be. The Qadir made a grumbling noise that sounded like an unsettled stomach. There are some things that are best not known. The old ones may discover you picking through their garbage and punish you for your effrontery. And punish us for not stopping you. Another silence from Mishra. Then the Argivian said, "As you say, most eminent one." He did not look down now, and his face was an impassive mask. Hajar could detect not a trace of sarcasm. Neither could the Qadir. He leaned back on his pillows and snatched a huge metal wine cup from its tray. "So, you are a scholar?" he inquired. "I am but a student," returned Mishra. "But I have much knowledge." "You know your phalange well," said the chieftain. Mishra shrugged. "I had good teachers. It was one more tool in learning the past." The Qadir rumbled again. Hajar had already surmised that the leader of the Suwardi had little time for or interest in the past. "You know the Outlander languages, Argive, Korlist, and Yoshan." He spat the last name like a curse. "They are one and the same language," said Mishra calmly, "though there are differences in dialect and accent. The dialects diverged over centuries due to..." The Qadir held up a hand, and the young man was immediately silenced. "You know your calculations?" "I do. I have 9 patrols of 8 men each." "How many men do I have?" asked the Qadir. 72, replied Mishra immediately. 4 of those patrols are mounted on horseback. "How many legs are there?" said the Qadir with a harsh smile. 272, returned the Argivian, smoothly, apparently without thinking. The Qadir's face darkened again, and he looked at Hajar. The younger phalange thought for a long moment, his fingers twitching, as he sorted mounted and unmounted troops, and number of legs of each. Then he nodded. The Qadir regarded the stocky slave with stony eyes. "You will do." To the guards he said, "Take him out and bathe him." To Mishra he said, "Rakik, you'll be my son's tutor. Teach him to speak your language and master his calculations. Do this and you will be treated well. Fail me, and you will be killed." Mishra rose and bowed deeply. "As your will is merciful, eminent one." The 2 guards flanked Mishra again. One of them still carried the hobbles. The other put a hand on Mishra's shoulder. The stocky Argivian turned and left without saying a word. Hajar noted that throughout the entire conversation, the young Qadir, the smaller version of his father, had said nothing, and seemed no more interested in his new tutor than in anything else in the tent. Hajar had left the Argivians' camp when the last of the Outlander students had fled back to the coastal lowlands, and the bits of metal they had excavated had been carefully shipped away on ox-drawn carts. He wanted Armel to come with him, but the old digger chose to remain in the area. Hajar joined one band of nomads, and then another, finally finding his way to the Qadir's camp. A distant relation on each one's mother's side gave him tentative entrance, and his hard work and bravery in a raid against a merchant caravan cemented the young phalange's position within the camp hierarchy. But now he had taken a risk, recommending one of Takashi's students as the young Qadir's tutor. His own fortunes would be tied to those of the Argivian now, and Mishra's failure would be considered his own. Haja visited Mishra's new quarters, a small open-sided hut, near the cooks, whenever he could. When Mishra was not teaching, he was expected to aid in the preparation of meals, simple, lumpish tasks such as fetching wood, tending the fire, and butchering meat for smoking. At first things did not seem to go well. At 10 years old, the young Qadir had no more interest in language and calculations than did his father. Worse, he seemed utterly repelled by the idea of being taught by anyone, particularly an outlander. Mishra, for his part, was desolate. "I will be back digging ditches back within a fortnight," he said one evening to Haja, as he hobbled to gather more brush to tuck into the fire pit. Haja knew better. To fail the Qadir did not result in demotion, but in death. Neither he nor Mishra had asked if there had been previous tutors, but the implication was that there had been. There were Argivian books in the young Qadir's quarters, as well as an abacus. Both books and abacus had been apparently untouched by the chieftain's son's hands. "He does not want to learn," said Mishra firmly, "and I will not spend my days speaking to a wall." The Argivian let out a deep sigh. "All he cares about is battle and the great things his father has done, and what he will do when he becomes Qadir." "Perhaps I could speak with the Qadir," said Haja, then shook his head at the foolishness of his own idea. The father cared even less about knowledge than his son, except he demanded that his son know what he did not. It was a demand with the steel edge of a sword master's blade. "At best, he fidgets," resumed Mishra. "At worst, he sleeps. I once prodded him awake, and he had his guards beat me." The stocky scholar rubbed his shoulder. "It is not something I want to do again. I am sorry it is not working out the way I had hoped," said Haja. "As well," returned the scholar. "And it just seems so hopeless. I feel empty inside. Empty and useless." Indeed, the Argivian looked as if he had not slept for some time. It could not be the work, thought Haja, for his life was slightly easier in that regard. It had to be something else. Perhaps his own sense of failure gnawed at him. Haja was silent for a moment, then said, "Why did you learn phallology?" Mishra looked up at the younger man. "What?" Haja continued. "The Argivian woman knew our language, but she had to deal with Armal and the other diggers. None of the Outlander students seemed particularly interested in learning more than the curse words. Your brother never learned, as far as I know. But you did. Why?" "My brother was interested in devices, in things," said Mishra wearily. "I have always found people more interesting." "There were people among the Argivian students," said Haja. "Why did you learn our language?" Mishra shrugged his shoulders. "I suppose I wanted to hear the old legends of your people. The genie nations, the heroes, and the princesses. The dragons you call Makfar and the warriors. When they were put in my language, the stories always seemed dry, shriveled things, bloodless and lifeless. They meant more in their original tongue." "And don't you Outlanders have your own legends?" asked Haja. "Old battles and legends?" "Well, of course," said Mishra. "There was the tale of the grey pirate who raided the Corlus coast, and of the warrior queen of Argive who lived 500 years ago. There are all manner of old god stories that they only believe in Yosha and other backward nations." Haja smiled. "Perhaps your young charge would rather hear about those stories instead." and that might encourage him to learn the language as well. Mishra thought for a moment, then nodded. And put your calculations lessons in terms of things he understands, continued Hajar. Remember the question the Qadir put to you. Probably that was how he learned his ciphers and fractions. Mishra did not say anything for a moment, but stared into the cook fire. You might be right, he said at last. It's worth a try at least. Worth a try for both our sakes, said Hajar. He added, also, you can teach him how to curse in Argivian. I'm sure the boy would like that as well. Several months passed. Things seemed to go better for the Argivian scholar, and Hajar allowed himself to relax. If anything went wrong at this late date, it was unlikely that he would now be remembered and blamed for recommending the young man's tutor. Indeed, Mishra's lessons, now couched in Argivian history and Yotian mythology, seemed to have more than their desired effect on the young Qadir. He had gathered a basic feel for the Outlander's language, and had professed even an interest in Argivian customs beyond the battlefield. The youth's temper toward his slave tutor had improved as well, and the beatings became less frequent, then disappeared entirely. Nor, according to Mishra, did the youth sleep in class anymore. Indeed, the young Qadir seemed almost to warm to the Argivian scholar, and oft-times now Mishra was spared from his cleaning duties in order to finish a tale begun earlier in the afternoon. One evening Mishra had asked Hajar to attend as the young Qadir recited the tale of the Grey Pirate and the Last of the Sea Dragons. There were about a dozen attending, but only Hajar and Mishra understood what the boy was saying fully. He would tell part of the tale in Argivian, then speak again in Falagi. The Falagi versions were much more florid, obscene, and bloody in their descriptions, but Mishra did not correct the youth. Soon afterward Mishra's hobbles were removed, though he still was expected to tend the cooking fires when not in the young Qadir's company. Hajar's own life went well. Many of the local tribes swore fealty to the Suwardi. The clan's raids had become more effective and the tribes more prosperous. Merchant caravans were held for tolls and in some cases outright ransom. Several Argivian settlements on Falagi land were removed by fire and sword. When the Argivians sent the slow, heavy-armored patrols into Suwardi lands seeking retribution, the more nimble Falagi had evaded them. So it was with some surprise when Hajar, following one such raid, was summoned to the Qadir's tent. Save for the ceremonial guards, no one else was present. The Qadir leaned back on his pillows, turning something large and green in his fingers. Hajar entered, knelt in respect, and waited. You know the Rakik tutor, said the Qadir presently. He did not look in Hajar's direction. I do, said Hajar, rising after being addressed. He suddenly wondered how much he should admit regarding Mishra. He has done well, said the Qadir. The boy knows his additions and subtractions, his ciphers and fractions. And he speaks Outlander passingly well, I am told. Very well, indeed, said Hajar. I have heard him speak, and his words are well formed and proper. The boy is doing well, said the Qadir. Perhaps too well. The Qadir let the statement fall into silence. Finally Hajar said cautiously, how so, most eminent one? The Qadir held up the green object to his eye, regarding it as a merchant inspects his stock. Do you know what this is? Hajar had never seen it before, but he knew at once what it was one of the power stones that Tawnos and the brothers had always made a fuss over. It still held its energy, for it glowed with a bright jade sheen. This one glowed even though it had been broken, sheared along one side. Haja thought of one of the stories around the diggers' fires. After the brothers returned from the secret heart of the pouch that Mishra had kept around his neck. Carefully he chose his words. "It looks like an eye of the old ones," he said, using the Phalagi word for the power stone. The Qadir grumbled, making that low camel about to spit sound that so unsettled Haja. Indeed, there are Argivians and Yotians as well, trespassing into the desert looking for trinkets such as this. What do you know about this particular one? Haja was silent, attempting to gather his thoughts, but the Qadir pressed on. This one was taken from the Rakik tutor when he was captured. It was put among my treasures and forgotten. But my son asked about it the other day, and I had it brought out. Why does my son request it? Haja was silent for a moment, hoping that this was another rhetorical question. It was not. At last he ventured, probably. The tutor mentioned it to him, and he was curious. The Qadir gave a low harumph and said, and perhaps he wants it back, eh? Now why would the Rakik want this particular stone? Perhaps it has special meaning to him, replied Haja quickly. Look at the way it is cut along one side. Shattered, not cut, returned the Qadir shrewdly. And shattered eyes are often useless and dull. This one still holds whatever fire the old ones imbued it with. So this may be special. The question is, how special is it? Haja thought of that last night in the Argivian camp and the unearthly lights that had shone from the brothers' cabin. The stones, Tawnos had said. She had said something about the stones. Then there had been the blast and the fire, and Mishra had disappeared into the desert until Haja had found him digging a ditch in the Qadir's camp. He had never asked what had really happened that night. He had assumed it was something that Mishra's older brother, the lean, spooky one, had done. Haja gulped for a moment, then said, I cannot say. Respected one. The Qadir made that low gurgling noise again and said, neither can I. And for that reason I will deny it to my son, so he is not tempted to pass it into the hands of the Rakik. I will keep it myself and see if it carries any power of the old ones. He slipped the gem into a voluminous pocket of his vest and shifted position, facing Haja fully now. He laced his fingers before his face and said, the question now is, why would the boy ask for something on behalf of the Rakik? Haja stammered, then said, it could be that your son heard of the stone from the Rakik and wanted it for his own. The Qadir tilted his head for a moment, as if considering that option for the first time. Perhaps, he said, shaking his head. Or perhaps he wanted to retrieve it for his friend and tutor. Haja searched for the proper words. A Qadir's son would never be friends with an outlander Rakik. Agreed, replied the Qadir. My fear, though, is that he listens to the outlander too much. He leans on him, as a man leans on a crutch. And if one leans too often, one forgets how to walk on one's own. Haja said softly, I do not think you need to fear that occurring. I fear nothing, said the Qadir quickly. But now the boy will ride on our raids as well. He is young, but not too young to learn a man's craft of battle. He will be taught when he is in camp, but otherwise the Rakik will have only the cook fires to worry about. Tell me, if he spends his time on our raids, will the boy still know enough by the end of next year to be considered educated? Hajar thought for a moment. The Qadir's son was now more knowledgeable than most of the other Suwardi in camp. But somehow he felt that was the wrong answer. Instead, he spoke most of the truth. By the end of next year. Yes, he would. The Qadir leaned back on his pillows. Excellent. When the boy comes of his majority, he will no longer need the crutch. And when that time comes, that crutch will be broken and cast aside. Do I make myself clear? Hajar looked into the Qadir's porcine eyes. It was very clear. Indeed. The Qadir worried about his son's loyalties. When the time came, Mishra would be taken out into the desert and killed. Quietly. Hajar would oversee that slaying on the Qadir's command. Hajar heard himself say, "As you wish, respected one. Your words are as law." The Qadir waved him off, and Hajar knelt briefly, then fled the tent. Hajar's mouth felt as if it had been filled with dust. He had heard the Qadir's death warrant, and he knew if he disobeyed he would be signing his own. And for what? A pack of fatherly fears. And half a stone. Hajar walked past the prince's tent and saw, through the opening, Mishra and the young Qadir talking. Their voices were low, but they frequently broke apart and laughed, sharing private jokes. The Qadir's son motioned, and Mishra poured drinks. He lifted his cup and joined the young Qadir in a toast of nabis. Hajar frowned. Perhaps the old Qadir was not wrong in his worries about his son. Perhaps as a youth the Qadir himself had a friend upon whom he depended, and who mysteriously disappeared one day. Perhaps, thought Hajar, that was the nature of being a leader. One relies on others, but one does not depend utterly on them. Hajar decided to walk back to his own quarters the long way around. He would not tell Mishra and could not tell the Qadir's son. He would hope that once the lad had more battle experience, he would be less interested in the scholar's teachings. With that diminished interest, the Qadir's fears and the death sentence would vanish. Unlikely, thought Hajar, but possible. After all, a lot could happen before the end of the next year. Mishra dreamed. As his body healed from its beatings and his spirit recovered from its daily exhaustion, Mishra's dreams grew stronger. Sometimes he dreamed of Takesha, sometimes of his brother. But most often he dreamed of the stone, as it sang to him out of the darkness. He had told the Qadir's son of the stone, and the boy had discovered that, yes, his father still had it in his possession. Mishra knew this already, for the stone held him to the camp as no hobbles ever could. So he dreamed of the stone, imagined it spinning in space, singing its plaintive dirge, crying out to him. He wanted it back. He wanted to go to it. And in his dreams he went. In the dream he awoke and realized he was somewhere else, far from the Suwardi encampment, far from the desert itself, far for the world. The sky above him was not filled with the familiar phalange stars, the thick light-dotted soup of the night sky. Instead it was overcast and dark, flickering with diffused pulses of lightning. He could see in the darkness, and he realized he was atop a low, bare tor, surrounded by thick vegetation. He heard the singing of his gem in the distance, and he moved toward it. The vegetation around the bare hillock was thick and tangled, but he moved through it as if he were a wraith. It was a riot of bright yellows and oranges against darker leaves. He paused and saw the leaves themselves had a strange sheen, as if they had been stamped from steel plates. The flowers as well were metallic, and dripped foul-smelling ether instead of nectar. He touched one of the leaves, and it reverberated to his touch. Its keening matched that of the stone, and he ignored the leaf, following the hard-tugging wail of his gem. He made a detour around a great pool with an oily film dancing across the surface. He looked away for a moment, and something large and black surfaced in the pond, then dived again. When he looked back, he saw only slowly spreading rings rippling out toward the borders. The water moved oddly, as if it were made of something thicker and more syrupy than ordinary water. He found a clear-shelled egg and for a moment thought it was his missing gem. On closer inspection, he saw that the hand-sized egg had a translucent shell, and within that shell a small, gold-colored creature was growing. No, not growing, he realized, being assembled. Smaller golden creatures were moving spans and joints around within the shell, assembling it like one of Urza's devices. As he watched, the thin form of a lizard's skin and skull appeared in the murky darkness of the egg. Then the singing began again. He set the egg down and followed the siren call. It began to rain, and the rain tasted like tears, leaving oil-streaked patches on his clothing. He followed the song. Finally he reached a building, a pyramid among the jungle of metal plants. The building's architecture seemed familiar. It was made of ropey roots and metallic cables. There were markings along the side of the building, but in his dream he could not decipher them. The plants had pulled the trailing roots away from the base of the pyramid, and Mishra saw a set of stairs leading upward to a small alcove. Within that cave shone the greenish light of the Power Stone. Yes, he had seen this type of building before. He had been inside one once, in a hallway lined with mirrors, when he had first gained the stone that now waited for him. There was a loud metallic crash to his right among the thick, serrated leaves. A huge brass head erupted from the surrounding vegetation. At first Mishra thought it was a giant serpent, for it had a huge triangular head mounted at the end of a looping metallic neck. Then the beast emerged fully, and Mishra saw the neck was moored to a huge elephantine body with leonine paws ending in sharp steel claws. It was a dragon, but a mechanical one, crafted by unknown hands and granted inhuman life. Its eyes were dull, flickering blue gems. Steam vented from its nostrils and leaked from its joints. It was an engine built in the shape of a great worm. The dragon engine saw Mishra and let out a low, challenging bellow. Then it began to move forward, half loping, half slithering from its jungle hiding place. Mishra froze for a moment, but only for a moment. Then he fled up the stairs, toward his lost gem. His dream logic told him that if he reached the gem, everything would be fine. The stairs seemed to elongate endlessly, and his feet were suddenly mired in tar. Still he pressed upward, feeling the hot breath of the dragon engine behind him. Finally he reached the top of the steps, and his fingers closed around the green gem. At the first touch of the gem, a wave of peace washed over Mishra, and he forgot the steam-dripping engine behind him. When he did turn, the creature was no longer trying to scale the stairs to reach him. Instead it lay along the length of the steps. Its ears were laid back along its head, and its eyes flickered not with rage, but with obedience. Steam dribbled weakly from its nostrils. It was waiting for him to tell it what to do. Mishra held up the gem, and its light bathed the creature fully. It was truly a mechanical engine in dragon form. Its forelegs were like that of a dragon, but instead of rear limbs it possessed a set of linked plates curled over a collection of smaller wheels. Treads, thought Mishra. The device carried with it a continual road that could be laid down before it and picked up afterward. It made perfect sense. Interesting. Someone said the word, and Mishra wheeled around. No one spoke again, but Mishra heard the word echoing in his mind. There, above the alcove, was perched the mirror figure from his earlier vision, a creature of bones, armor, horns, and tendrils. Somehow, Mishra knew this was more than just another construct, with its exposed muscles of rope-like cables and its backward-pointing horns. It was a living thing, a powerful one, and unlike the engine, it would not be cowed by the power of the stone. A creature perched over the alcove regarded Mishra for a long moment. The young man was dimly aware that the long tresses along the creature's horns were more like draped tentacles and moved of their own volition. Then the creature laughed at Mishra, a dry, hollow laugh, the laugh of a skeleton. "Give me the stone," shouted the creature, and leapt down on top of him. Mishra screamed. He tried to wake himself up, tried to force himself to run, tried to force the dragon engine to defend him. But the horn creature laughed, and Mishra felt its claw-like grip close around his own hand, the one holding the gem. There was a wrenching pain along his arm as the creature pulled the gem away, taking Mishra's arm with it. Mishra screamed again and woke. He was in his tent, the open-sided tarp pitched near the cooking fire. One of the guards was by the fire, looking at him but not moving either to help or to punish. Mishra looked at his left arm. It was still there, though. There were streaks of red along its length, as if a briar had worn its way along its length, or as if claws had grabbed it. His fist was clenched tightly. Slowly Mishra opened his fingers. There was no green gem at the center of his hand. There was nothing at all. Mishra took a deep breath. It was a dream, more savage and lifelike than before, but still a dream. He exhaled slowly. Then the ground beneath him began to shake. Haja was on guard duty that night, but at the far perimeter of the camp. One of the survivors later said he heard the young Kadir's Rakik cry out a curse before the abyss yawned open and released its hell creature, but that could have been something added after the fact. So much of what happened that night was later embellished. At first Haja thought it was nothing more than a night tremor, a shifting of the sands cooling after the hot summer heat. Sometimes a ripple like that traveled thousands of miles, from the Sardian mountains all the way to Zegon. Some said such tremors were omens, but then, in the desert, anything the least bit unusual was assumed to be an omen. But a night tremor lasted for a moment, perhaps two, then subsided. This one persisted for a full 10 seconds. Then it grew stronger. Already the camp was reacting to the assault. The goats rushed from one end of their pen to the other, looking for some means of escape. Several of the horses, tethered for the evening, pulled at the reins, trying to escape. There were shouts among the camp as guards called to each other, and sleeping Falaji awoke to find the earth rippling about them. Haja shouted but did not know if he made any noise. Already, the roar of the earth was more than his ears could take. Tents came loose from their moorings and collapsed. The low fence around the goat pen was shaken free, and the goats, flurry of white and grey, bounded to freedom. The horses pulled their pegs loose from the ground and fled into the night. Then the Macfarware escaped from its earthen prison and bored up through the center of the camp. It was a dragon of the old legends, its head a wedge-shaped spike that effortless plowed from the ground, followed by a chain-like neck, and finally a great body made of metal ribs. It took a moment for that to sink in on Haja. The Macfarware was made entirely of metal, its brass hide shining in the moonlight. Several of the guards were already fleeing, but more were rushing toward the monstrosity. A creature had appeared from below, near the center of the camp, near the Qadir's tent. In some fallagy, that inspired loyalty, in others, fear. Haja felt nothing more than life-saving caution. Gripping his spear, he spiraled around the perimeter of the camp, hoping to pick up some reinforcements before charging the beast. Some of his brethren would not wait to gain allies and were already attacking the creature. In response, it snaked its head down in a leisurely gesture and snagged one of the attacking men. Its jaws closed on the head and shoulders of the attacker, and the warrior screamed. The scream continued as the dragon snapped its head up like a whip, opening its jaws as its head reached its highest point of the arc and releasing its attacker. The scream sailed over Haja's head and was suddenly cut short when the warrior landed in the darkness beyond the camp. Other warriors were attacking now, but their curved swords and barbed swordy spears had no more effect than if they were trying to hack through a stone wall. The dragon's head darted forward again and came up with the struggling form of another warrior. This one it shook back and forth like one of the Qadir's dogs tormenting a hare. It flung that man away as well, and slowly climbed the rest of the way out of its pit. Haja wanted to charge as well, as many of the warriors were doing, to protect the Qadir and the camp, to gain revenge against the creature. But the part of him that had worked for Amal in the Argivian woman's camp knew what the thing had to be, and who would best know how to handle it. He found Mishra huddled beneath his tarp, curled into a small ball. "The dream," he muttered, his eyes welded shut. The dream. It seemed to Haja as if the youth were trying to wish the creature away. "It's real," snapped Haja, adding in Argivian, "It is a device. An artifact. You know about such devices. How do we defeat it?" The Outlander's words seemed to pull the scholar from his panic. "Of course," he said slowly. "It has to be a device. Perhaps not Thran, but still a device. I must have the stone." "Stone," said Haja, a sick feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. "A green gem, cut in half," said Mishra quickly. "They took it from me when I first came here. With it I can weaken the dragon engine." "I've seen it," said Haja, turning toward the battle. Quietly he added, "The Qadir has it." Haja looked across the devastation that the dragon engine had already created. Women, children, and elderly were already fleeing the camp, while the warriors had regrouped for another assault. The Fallaji youth saw the broad figure of the Qadir. Among them, there was a flash of green against the Qadir's broad chest. There. Haja pointed to the large figure of the Suwardi chieftain. "He has it." He did not wait to see if Mishra was following, but leapt forward into the fray. Haja was about 200 paces behind the main mass of men, led by the Qadir. His position saved his life. The dragon engine leaned forward and opened its mouth in front of the charging concentration of men. There was the sound of a whirlwind within the great beast's body, and it breathed a gout of red-tinged steam. Haja heard screams ahead of him as the billowing cloud enfolded the warriors. He felt the heat and staggered back a few paces, then charged forward again into the quickly dissipating cloud. The men had been cooked where they stood, their flesh peeled back and charred by the heat. Haja felt bile rising in his throat, but he looked around for a large form, a form that had to be the Qadir. Haja found him face down in the dirt, a growing pool of blood beneath his body from where the steam had disintegrated the Qadir's skin down to the bone. Cursing the task, Haja knelt next to the old man's corpse and began rifling his pockets. Haja looked up only once, to see an assault led by the Qadir's son make a minimal impact on the creature's armored hide. The Qadir had been true to his word and had kept the stone close to him. It glowed now, reflecting the embers of the charred flesh around it. Haja grabbed the stone and made the mistake of looking up again. He stared directly into the eyes and more of the Makfawa. There was thought behind those eyes, Haja realized. This was not like the Suchi or the plodding Onolits of the Argivian camp. There was an intelligence within those eyes and a malignancy behind that intelligence. The Makfawa looked at Haja and knew in an instant who he was, what he was holding in his hands, and why he could not use it. The dragon opened its mouth, and there was the sound of desert wind again. Haja knew what to expect next and bolted for the perimeter of the camp. His back blazed as the passing cloud of steam dissipated around him. Then he was free of it and saw Mishra approaching from the other direction. Haja looked back. The Makfawa was already breaking loose of its bank of steam. It lumbered forward toward them. Haja turned and tossed the half-stone at Mishra. Then he jumped aside, covering his face with his arms on the chance that Mishra did not truly know what to do to defeat the dragon engine. Maybe, he thought desperately, the dragon would think him dead and pass him by. For a long moment Haja held his position. At any moment he expected to feel the dragon's wrath. When it did not come, he slowly moved his hands away from his face. The Makfawa was supine, looking for all the world like one of the Qadirs. No, Haja reminded himself, the late Qadirs. Dogs. Its steel talon paws were drawn up under its forward haunches, and Haja noted that instead of rear feet it had a curious set of wheels and plates. The dragon engine's neck was bolt straight and lying flat on the ground, an arrow with the beast's metallic snout as its head. Streamlets of reddish steam hissed from the corners of its closed mouth. At the point of the arrow stood Mishra, holding the green half-gem aloft. In his hands the power stone was shining brightly, a beacon in the night. Haja stood and staggered over to the scholar. "Did you kill it?" he asked. Mishra shook his head, and his voice sounded distant. "No. This is different. It is not weakened by me. I think it obeys me." There were shouts, and Haja saw the young Qadir approaching. He was bleeding from a nasty cut along one arm, and his reddened face looked as if he had caught part of the steam cloud. "Is it dead?" he shouted at Mishra. "Subdued," replied the scholar. I think I can control it now." The young Qadir nodded and said, "My father will be pleased." Haja started, then spoke. I am sorry, young one, but your father is. He let his voice trail off. You are Qadir now. As he spoke, he saw a veil come down over the young Qadir's face. It was as if the news had turned the youth to stone, had petrified his features. His face suddenly seemed harder than he had moments before when he was just the son of the Qadir. The new Qadir nodded and turned to Mishra. You can control this thing? It was a blunt question. I believe I can, said Mishra. Can anyone else? Asked the young chieftain. Mishra thought for a moment, then shook his head. I believe that if your father could have, he would. Then another pause. We can check later. Agreed, said the young Qadir. Take this thing away from the camp for the moment and remain with it until morning. 2. Hajar, he said, take me to my father's body. We must inspect the wounded and see how much damage has been done. We have lost much this night. He looked at the dragon engine thoughtfully and said, as much to himself as to Hajar, but perhaps we have gained much as well. Hajar and Mishra hesitated for only a moment, but it was enough to earn the reproach from the new Qadir of the Suwardi chief most of the Falaji tribes. Get in moving, Mishra said softly. As you wish, most revered one. I remain your Rakik. No, said the young man, holding up a hand in the same manner as his father had months before. His face softened for a moment. You are no longer Rakik, a slave. I make you now Raki, my wizard. I will need you at my side with this amazing device. With it we can maintain our hold over the other tribes and gain new ones as well. Will you serve me willingly? Mishra dropped to one knee and said, of course. Hajar was impressed as well. The boy acted as if he had been preparing for this moment and knew exactly what had to be done. Thank you, said the youth to Mishra. Truly your mother and my mother must have shared a common mother. But right now, let's hurry. We have much yet to do this night. Chapter 8.